Welcome, everybody, and welcome to another podcast of Upon Further Review. I'm Mike with Troy, and today we have a special podcast where we're going to talk about Juneteenth. And we're going to dive right into it. I'm going to talk about the history of Juneteenth. I'm going to talk about how it came about, why it was celebrated, and kind of tie that into have a discussion about how that ties in today. So, as many of you know, slavery, big thing that happened here in these United States, uh, was ended technically with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was on January 1st, 1863. And some people celebrate that as Emancipation Day, that had been celebrated. But more commonly referred to, the real end of slavery is more commonly referred to as June 19th, 1865. And the reason that is because even though the Emancipation Proclamation made it illegal to own slaves, that didn't necessarily stop people from the South from owning slaves. And also, little known fact that a lot of border states in the Union was continue to pretty much skirt the law and be allowed to have slaves because of Lincoln's fear that those border states would end up leaving the Union and going to the South. So it wasn't until almost 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation do we actually get to the Juneteenth celebration on June 19th, where we celebrate the official end of slavery. Uh, and I use that in quotes because slavery, we all know, persisted on different forms after that. So, pretty much in Galveston, Texas, June 19th, 1865, General Granger made a proclamation. He gathered up all the whites and blacks, slaves, slave owners, people who were just regular old citizens, Native Americans. Everybody came together for this proclamation that he read, and I'm gonna read the proclamation to you. Journal Order Number 3. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with this proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former master and slaves, and the connection hereforth existing between them becomes that between the employer and the hired laborer. The free men are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at a military post and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Now, that's a loaded statement, but pretty much just saying, okay, you're free, but don't come up to the military to expect us to really enforce, and where you guys can feel like you have safe harbor. You're free, and they kind of wash their hands of it, right? The military from a certain point of view, and they're saying that even though you're free, you should still keep working for your quote unquote former masters, right? And it's a pretty loaded thing. And what they were trying to do is not cause an uproar, with tons of free men now, free men, women, and children be able to leave and go wherever they have a place to go. So they were trying to do that. And they were trying to still appease always the former slave owners with not having, all of their, once forced workers just flee their plantation. So even in that order that was read out to the people, you can see that they were still trying to put a measure of control on those slaves. Now, the importance of why it happened in Galveston, Texas. So Texas, you have to remember at that point was the frontier state, right? It's one of the most western states. It's still considered frontier land, and there people actually used to send their slaves to actually be, they call them slave refugees, as in slave owners who were afraid that their slaves are about to be free would literally ship their slaves to Texas because it was such a frontier state and not it wasn't too tied in or too integrated with the rest of the United States yet to try to hide their slaves there. So it was important to having to have the army march all the way to Texas to make this proclamation there and give out these orders that slaves are free because there was a lot of slaves being sent there by their masters to kind of hide out there and try to ride this whole emancipation thing out. So it was a very big importance of why they came over all the way down to Texas from that. Slaves, a lot of slavers there refused to acknowledge the freedom of their slaves. And you can look at writings of once this was read, certain people started gathering things up. They were moving, they were trying to go find family members, lost family members or relatives. And there's accounts of free slaves having to go into the forest and woods and on their travel, going by tree upon tree upon tree of hanging former slaves because a lot of these slavers were saying, hey, I'd rather you die than let you go free. And that really shows you the depravity and the deep seated hatred that was really alive back then. They'd rather kill them than let them go free, right? And of course, this went unpunished. And slavery was, that announcement was a world, rocking thing throughout, especially the South, because you understand slavery, even though slaves were the economic engine of the South, most white people weren't rich enough to own slaves, right? I think that's a bit of a misconception. You think that every white person in the South owned slaves. That's not true. Only the wealthy whites owned slaves. But they knew that as long as they had these slaves and they oppressed these people, and as long as the poor whites saw them superior, which is still a mentality that goes on to today, that they could keep everything under control. They could make a sense of order of things, right? So when these slaves became free, this order of things still didn't change. As long as even if I am a poor white farmer, as long as I can look down on a black man, I know I have a feel of a sense of superiority, and I can turn my anger, anguish, and hate, and all my ill will feelings to that person. So, moving on a little bit, slavery is ended June 19th in Galveston, Texas. Slaves at that point, the next year is when they come together and really have a big celebration. They are celebrating their freedom. Some people, like I said, some slaves celebrating on Emancipation Day, but the gathering on June 19th, 1866, thousands and thousands of people came and celebrated their freedom. And this became kind of an annual tradition. There's like food and festivities, and even back then they were making ghetto fireworks by putting gunpowder into trees and igniting them and making big grand explosions, really celebrating their freedom. And this kind of really continued on a yearly basis for a while. I mean, these were big celebrations that went on throughout the years. Even politicians would come and and speak at these events because so many tens of thousands of people will come and gather at them. It was a very big deal. It was a very big celebration. It was a very important celebration. And the word Juneteenth is actually a portmanteau, which is a SAT word for you, which means you're pretty much mashing two words together, June and 19th. And around the 1890s, that's when that term kind of that term Juneteenth was kind of coined. And now you see that the celebration continues on. It really continues growing and growing in popularity until you get to about I think it was about the 1920s. Around that time, things start ramping up. You have the Great Depression, you have the World War One ramping up, you have rampant xenophobia happening in the United States, and kind of you still see today the same thing. Whites thought that blacks shouldn't really celebrate this holiday because it was quote unquote unpatriotic. And what we still see today is of the trying to whitewash history and say you're still on that slavery stuff that was so long ago. I don't know why you're celebrating that. You need to just get under the American flag. It's unpatriotic for you to be celebrating this day, right? And it actually kind of died down and it simmered down the celebration that people have. And also around that time, we had blacks that were migrating, from the South throughout the rest of the United States. So usually family units that were really tight knit and that would come together for these celebrations were moving further and further apart. That kind of, prohibited these large kind of gatherings, right? And start to see a little bit of a resurgence of it um, around the Texas Centennial. So in the Texas Centennial, they have a big fairground in Dallas, and during the Centennial, essentially they gather all the history of Texas and the United States, and they do this big displays and erect these huge structures, and kind of just showing off, all the accomplishments that they kind of had to that day. And what the blacks did is they asked, they asked Texas government, could we also get some of the funding to make a Hall of Negro Life, which was essentially an ode to all the accomplishments and successes that Black people have had in this country up to that date. And of course, Texas said no. And they actually, surprisingly enough, several men went and petitioned the federal government, and the federal government actually gave them funds to make this Hall of Negro Life in the Texas Centennial, and this kind of reignited that Juneteenth celebration pride. It was around the same time, and people, tens of thousands of African Americans, came down and saw this grand Hall of Negro Life and all the accomplishments that blacks have done. And then after the centennial was over, of course, the Texas government decided to demolish the Hall of Negro Life, despite letting other structures stay. Some of them are still standing to this day, right? And then you see once again that the pride and the celebration of Juneteenth kind of simmers down a little bit, all the way up until about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where you'll start seeing it pick up some steam. And then the Black Power movement in the 70s and 80s, and then really starts picking up a little bit of steam. And people were celebrating there and kind of reconnecting with their cultural heritage and being proud of that. Then you see, once again, it goes, I won't say underground, but takes a little bit of law in terms of its popularity in the 90s and early 2000s. And then, of course, with the recent surge of police brutality and the recent highlight on, how much African Americans have to, have gone through this country, how much we had to put up with, and how much, further we still have to go to get equality and equity in this country. The spotlight's kind of put back on to kind of reconnecting to those roots and celebrating, because essentially is our Independence Day, right? As African Americans, your Independence Day isn't July 4th because you were still enslaved at that time. You know, your Independence Day is actually, if you want to consider it, is June 19th. And that's kind of a brief, history and rundown of June 19th, how it got started, kind of its history throughout the years, and kind of how we got to now that it's getting more recognized. You're seeing that more companies and organizations are starting to recognize it as a holiday. That I believe the state of Virginia, Troy, the governor Ralph Northam just announced that it's a paid state holiday for all his state employees. So now we're starting to gain traction, and I'm going to ask you, where do you think this goes? What do you think? Maybe not under this current administration, but you think that one day that Juneteenth will actually become a federally recognized holiday? Because let's be honest, it is a very important day. It's a very important day for a large population in your country where slavery ended, right? Now, what do you think about that?
One thing to consider is that a lot of people, before I even dive into this, will sit here and say, why do we have to keep, having this divisive things? Why do we keep focusing on race? Why is it that we keep talking about these issues? The reality is, I wish we never had to. We did not drag ourselves across the oceans in the transatlantic slave trade. We did not make ourselves enslaved. And even after slavery ended, we did not keep the legacy of state sponsored racism lasting all the way up to 1964. You hit the nail on the head there. Independence Day was celebrated from the Declaration of Independence in July 4th, 1776. We're going to be a new nation, a new country. We are saying that we are free, but we, as African Americans, were not included at that time. And more critically, even going all the way down to the Dred Scott decision, we were never intended to be uh, to take part in that freedom, to take part in the joys of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness here. The Emancipation Proclamation took 2 years to ripple across. And mind you, the Civil War is still raging on. So obviously, these Confederate states think they're going to be their own country and they don't have to listen to the President of the United States of America. And that's also why it's quite important to understand what people are talking about when they're referring to, with great pride, the Confederacy. It was to ensure that people that look like you, Mike, and people that look like me, my parents, my ancestors, all of them, it was to ensure that we were kept enslaved and to have to constantly deal with terrorism, rape, murder. This was not a kind, gentle slavery, by the way. This was not people just living and working in harmony. And some of the many stories that they try to pawn off in these whitewashed history classes that we see in today's day and age. This was horrific. The stories of George Washington's, teeth being made out of wood. No, they were made out of slave teeth, ripped from the mouths of those he saw fit. Slavery was horrific, and that's what makes the Confederate flag so horrific and the Confederacy so horrific. And I don't mean to get sidetracked there, but it's quite important to remember that. One of the very first places that the Emancipation Proclamation was read was on those beautiful, beautiful shores on what would eventually become our alma mater, Hampton University, underneath the great Emancipation Oak, one of the great trees of the world. People finding out, they can't even read it themselves. They had to be educated there on those shores, and that's what eventually will become our very own Hampton University. But finding out that they're now free, and the states you hit the nail on the head. The states that were in rebellion were got their freedom, and the key is June 19th of 1865. Well, the Confederacy surrendered in April of 1865. And you actually had slave owners and government officials who know that the Confederacy is over, know that they have surrendered, know there's not going to be a Confederacy and slavery is coming to an end. They were literally trying to get their last harvest out with this free labor. Like 2 extra months, it's as far away as they can hide it, of slavery because they're unwilling to release this labor and let these people go free. So, yes, June 19th is a Black Independence Day because we were not declared independent on July 4th, 1776. It wasn't until finally all the way across of what was then the United States of America, June 19th of 1865, that and one of the good things we see now is that it's been a state holiday and it's drawn renewed significance. But it also puts an emphasis for me, Mike, on the lack of history being taught in our public schools across the country. This should not be a story that we have to tell. I had peers who have no idea I know of Black peers, of course, who have no idea what Juneteenth is, and they think it's some current thing that's popped up, another part of a quote unquote liberal agenda, and that's insane to me. That we're not teaching history, we're not teaching real history because we don't want to look back and reflect upon just how horrific things were. And that's the I think that's the origin of some of the problems we still see in the year 2020. Because for many people out there, they don't get it. They don't understand why the idea of Aunt Jemima is racist, as if it wasn't from day one. They don't understand why the idea of Uncle Ben is racist, and we want to tell nice stories while glossing over just how horrific the things that they had to go through. They're glossing over the fact that these people were born slaves, the original characters in which they're based on. Their Independence Day was Juneteenth. I As this gains steam, a lot of it will depend on this next election. I can see if Democrats seize control of everything. Absolutely, Juneteenth becoming a national holiday because we have to look at some of the holidays we have. Columbus Day has come under fire in recent years because what are we ultimately celebrating? We know the man didn't originally discover the North American continent, and we also know that he committed egregious acts of genocide. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that this is not a man that should have statues and a holiday named after him. I'd rather remove that and call this the new federal holiday in its place, or just simply add this to the list of holidays that deserve its due recognition. And I think it would do a lot to help people understand real history, understand that people fought tooth and nail to keep us enslaved. People fought tooth and nail to ensure that they can step on our throats and do with us as they see fit. Even when the law said you got to go. And even when the Confederacy surrendered and it was all over, they wanted to hang on as long as they possibly could until literally the Union Army arrived to force this open reading. One thing I will say, you mentioned it in the actual reading of that took place in Galveston. I like how they said, yeah, you're free now, but please don't come to the nearest military base and don't look for us to give you any help. Even though you were enslaved, you were prevented from being able to read and write, and your only thing you can do now is literally the agricultural work of which you were forced. Don't worry, the same people who are just beating the shit out of you and torturing you and raping your wife and enslaving your children, don't worry, you're now just going to work for them for proper wages. That is that's government in a nutshell right there. But I guess we should just be happy, starting with the freedom.
I think it's, important to highlight, how contradictory this country can be in celebrating certain men who they deem to be very important and influential and great for this country, but they always seem to kind of white out their sins. They always seem to sweep that kind of stuff under the carpet. You talked about Christopher Columbus. You think about, President's Day and celebrating Thomas Jefferson, and he was a notorious slave owner. He raped his slaves, raped them. There's descendants to this day that are black of his from him raping his slaves. He owned over 600 slaves. He would kill them. He even wrote articles to be published in newspapers and journals about how blacks had no brain, or if they did, it was very small, and that we were incapable of any kind of intelligence. We have these men that are being highlighted and celebrated, blindly because, like you said, they don't teach history. They teach you a history light, a nice soft version to paint America in a very rosy lens where we're always the good guys, we're always on the right side of things. That's far from the truth. I mean, I bet many people didn't know that the first person to die for this country, the very first person to die for this country, was a black man by the name of Crispus Attucks in Boston. The very first person. So when people say my forefathers died for this country, we died for this country, the very first ones, trying to get freedom that we could not enjoy ourselves, right? So when we talk about important holidays, this is an important holiday. This, hopefully will start bringing education and bringing back the real history of this country. Because what's important about this is if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. And the sins of the past will be repeated in the present. And we see that happening time and time again. How many times do you go on Instagram or Facebook, or you see a news clip and you have some super very ignorant white person spouting some version of history that does not exist, and they believe it, and it's all by design if you look at it, because that's what they were taught in schools, right? They were taught this very whitewashed version of history, right? This holiday is important because it needs to be put on display so people understand the grim and brutal reality of what this country was founded on. It was literally founded on blood, sweat, and tears. But but most of those blood, sweat, and tears came from the African American population, right? And we need to understand, and the only way to understand that is to really take an honest look and examine the past and examine and celebrate days where America was something good for something other than a Caucasian man, right? were things in the past were things achievements of other peoples that that really went into the fabric of this nation, right? And Juneteenth is, I think, is a prime and a great holiday where people can celebrate, and it's just not for black people. If you're white, you should be happy. I don't understand why there should be a white person saying, I don't want to celebrate when black people got their freedom, right? I don't want to celebrate their independence. I mean, hey, do you prefer us to be enslaved? I mean, I don't understand why there should be any negativity towards it, because that is an important day, and that kind of shows you that there is some opposition to this is from a lack of education and understanding. Like I said, people thinking this is a recent phenomenon, and not knowing the importance of this day and what it meant to so many African American peoples throughout the course of history.
This country, in all of its economic might and power, it would be nothing if not but for the existence of slavery, which means nothing if not for the horrific torture and brutality endured by the Africans that were brought here. A lot of people will say it's the state of the world. It was something that went on at the time, but the reality is the United States were one of the last countries, civilized countries at the time, still clinging on to slavery. The United Kingdom even begun, breaking down their slave empires. We were the ones clinging on to it because we were a new country trying to get established on our own 2 feet. And this country was built for the white man at the time. The founding fathers believed it, and they all had slaves to prove it. And the reality is, Juneteenth should be a national holiday, it should be a federal national holiday. At the moment, I think 45 states have some form of recognition of Juneteenth, but obviously they don't shut down, and the banks don't shut down, and things of that nature. Texas became one of the first, actually, because of course it was here in Texas that Juneteenth became a thing, and I believe back in 1980 they made it a actual holiday. But again, it's not treated with the same respect nor reverence as even a Columbus Day. Trash pickup is still coming. Businesses are still going to be booming. The banks and government buildings are still going to be open. That should be fixed. And with that being fixed and recognized at the national level, and let's be honest, that's not happening unless Democrats control both sides and we get a president, or at least the president is a Democrat. Because I don't believe that the current GOP would institute such a thing. It's funny to me, the party of Lincoln, the party that wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, you'll hear that often, and how Democrats were the ones that were against this and third back then at the time. But why is it that in today, 2020, when we say, you know what, you're right, so let's rip down these Confederate statues of the people who stood against and wished to see death upon Lincoln and death upon the nation, we see so many people who are in the GOP and vote Republican defending these sorts of things. We've got to do a better job teaching history. A lot of people talk about Civil War and they talk about these things in today's day and age as a culture war, and they're being so divisive and they're trying to destroy. Well, as the saying goes, if you don't learn your history, you'll be doomed to repeat it. So many people think these things are just, issues being used to whip up for votes. They think these things are being used to sell ratings on CNN, and they don't take it seriously because they have no clue of Black history. Black history is American history. You cannot tell the story of this country without a deep dive into Black history, and a deep dive into Black history is horrific. That's just the sad reality of it. People fighting tooth and nail against the established order and law for the detriment of African Americans continues clean up into the 1970s. When the Civil Rights Act was passed, 1964, ending state-sponsored racism, they didn't just go silently into the night. You can go turn on Disney Plus and fire up. Remember the Titans? It was 1970. 6 years later, people are still fighting. The first little African American girl to be forcibly integrated into a all white school, Ruby Bridges, she is still alive. She's like 60, what, 1 years old? She's not that old. This is not something that that is ancient history. This is things that impacted African Americans in the current day. It impacted my mother, definitely my grandmother. These are things that cannot be taken lightly. And if you have any respect whatsoever for your fellow American, you have to, African American, I should say, you have to also be willing to understand and respect that history. It shouldn't take another, murder of a public murder of an African American to make you realize that, you know what, maybe we shouldn't have so many negative reminders of the past. Because if we ask to make Juneteenth a national holiday, oh no, we don't want to do anything of that. But yet, when we want to rip down the statue of these slavers and people who wish to destroy the country, no, 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 no. You're knocking down history. If you want to respect history, make Juneteenth a national holiday. If you want to respect history, teach it for all of its bloody horrors to people so that they understand where we are coming from in today's day and age. This is history I know. It's history you know. Coming from a predominantly African American area like Prince George's County, Maryland, growing up and going to the historically black colleges, we know our black history. No one, no one dare rejects or refuses the idea that history is important. But when it comes to things that honor African Americans and it comes to things that acknowledge the horrors, we wish to turn a blind eye. We can't do that anymore.
Guilt, it's the thing where if they acknowledge the past, they can't help but feel guilty about it, right? Because deep down in their hearts of hearts and souls of souls, they know that slavery was the economic engine that brought prosperity to this country. They know that because of what happened back then and continues to happen today in forms of other forms of oppression to minorities, they enjoy a privilege and they know that that privilege is there. When they say they don't have a privilege, they know they have the privilege. They know that they have a ability to do things that others cannot do. They have ability to say things others cannot say, and they have a certain sense of freedom in knowing that they will not be harmed, by law enforcement and the tyranny of government because of their color of their skin. They don't have that inherent fear in them, right? So they know that they benefited directly from slavery and they benefited directly from oppression of minorities and blacks throughout the course of the history of this country. And for them to acknowledge that, they have to shine a light on it. And when they shine a light on it, they can no longer deny that their privilege exists, right? If they actually look at history and see all that has happened and actually look at it, they can't deny that their privilege exists today because of the atrocities of the past. So, in closing, I just want to encourage everybody to celebrate Juneteenth. I took off work and I put it on my calendar and I said, hey, I ain't gonna be in tomorrow. I'm celebrating Juneteenth. I encourage, if you're black or white or Hispanic or Native American or whatever you are, you should celebrate Juneteenth because it's an important day. You don't hear people, saying, "Oh, that's a," some people say they try to say, "Oh, that's bringing us apart." I think it's actually bringing us together. Celebrating people's freedom. People celebrate Cinco de Mayo and they even know what Cinco de Mayo means. A lot of people say it's Mexican Independence Day, and it's totally wrong. It's a totally different holiday, right? So this is a holiday that has a lot of substance and relevance to this country. It's a holiday that you should do your research on. If you're able to take off work, I say you take off work and celebrate. And if you're not black, you still celebrate anyway, saying that that was a step in the right direction for this country, but many more steps need to be taken. And enjoy the day, celebrate, think about how far we've gone, we've come in this country, and how much further we still need to go. And it's a day I really encourage. It's a day of family and gathering and celebration. I know we can't gather in the physical right now because of the COVID-19, but checking in with people, especially checking in with those folks who've lived in tougher times than this. You talking about thinking about your parents and your grandparents, some of those who were in those original civil rights marches, right? Checking in on them and tell them how much you appreciate what they did and how they laid some of the groundwork to get to where we've gotten today. I know it still looks dark outside, but there's a brighter dawn on the horizon. And as long as we come together, acknowledge our past, and learn from our past as a country as a whole, hopefully we can navigate to some calmer waters. So, happy Juneteenth to all you guys out there. We appreciate you listening. Please like, rate, review, and everything. Spread the word. We try to inform you guys and give you guys our informed opinions, and hopefully educate you and enlighten you in some way, and bring some try to bring some further knowledge and prosperity to your lives. So we really appreciate all the love and support. Happy Juneteenth.